January 17, 1940, Dover, England. Dawn. The winter fog clings to the chalk cliffs like a shroud, rolling inland across fields of frozen mud. In the pale light, British soldiers huddle in makeshift workshops, converted barns and abandoned stables that smell of damp hay and oil. Their breath rises in clouds as they work with hammers and saws, constructing an army that will never fire a shot. Canvas stretches over timber frames. Paint buckets sit open in the cold, their contents thick as molasses. These men are not building weapons of war. They are building ghosts, phantom tanks, dummy aircraft, an entire fictional military force designed to deceive the most formidable war machine Europe has ever known. The wood creaks beneath their hands, the canvas flaps in the wind, and somewhere across the Channel, in the occupied territories and the Reich itself, German intelligence officers are watching, always watching. This is the beginning of history's greatest conjuring trick, a deception so audacious that when it succeeds, it will make the German Luftwaffe waste over 1,000 bombs on empty fields and plywood silhouettes. But in this frozen January morning, no one yet knows if the illusion will hold. The British are gambling everything on a simple premise that the human eye, even when aided by the most advanced optics of 1940, can be fooled. That perspective, shadow, and suggestion can create reality where none exists. That war is not only about steel and explosives, but about perception itself. The men working in these workshops are not conjurers by trade. They are carpenters, stagehands from London's West End, art students, and film set designers, summoned from civilian life into a new kind of service. They have been told their work is vital, though many do not yet understand why His Majesty's government is investing resources into fake equipment when real tanks are desperately needed at the front. But the architects of this scheme, men like Colonel John Turner and Major Jeffrey Barkas, understand something the soldiers in the workshops do not. That in modern warfare, the appearance of strength can be as valuable as strength itself. That an enemy who believes you are powerful may hesitate, may miscalculate, may waste precious resources attacking shadows. And in the desperate winter of 1940, with Britain standing alone against the Nazi war machine, every miscalculation the Germans make is a small victory, a borrowed moment of survival. The Germans, for their part, are supremely confident. Their intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and augmented by the Luftwaffe's aerial reconnaissance squadrons, is considered the finest in the world. They have photographed nearly every mile of British coastline. Their analysts pore over thousands of reconnaissance images daily, cataloging troop movements, counting aircraft at airfields, tracking the construction of defensive positions. They have the advantage of numbers, of experience, of recent triumph. Poland fell in weeks. France will fall in months. The British, isolated on their island, seem to the German High Command like a problem already solved, needing only the application of sufficient force. When German reconnaissance pilots return with photographs showing new tank formations in Kent and Essex, new airfields in Norfolk and Sussex, the intelligence officers note these developments with satisfaction. The British are preparing defenses exactly where logic dictates they should. Everything is proceeding as expected. But beneath this confidence lies an assumption that will prove fatal, that the British, so recently humiliated at Dunkirk, so obviously inferior in resources and industrial capacity, lack the imagination for truly sophisticated deception. That British military culture, with its emphasis on straightforward courage and traditional tactics, would never stoop to the kind of theatrical trickery the Germans are now observing through their lenses. The very idea seems beneath the dignity of a nation that once ruled a quarter of the world. This cultural assumption, this belief that they know their enemy, will cost the Luftwaffe dearly in the months to come. Because the British are not operating from a position of strength that allows for conventional thinking. They are improvising survival. And improvisation, born of desperation, often produces the most radical innovations. The concept of military deception is as old as warfare itself. Sun Tzu wrote of it in ancient China. The Trojan horse stands as Western civilization's founding myth of strategic trickery. But the scale and sophistication of what Britain is about to attempt has no precedent. This is deception as industrial enterprise, as systematic campaign, as a fundamental pillar of national defense strategy. It begins with a simple observation. German reconnaissance flights follow predictable patterns, photographing from specific altitudes, in specific weather conditions at specific times of day. The limitations of 1940s photographic technology mean that from 20,000 feet, detail becomes interpretation. The eye, or the camera, sees shapes, shadows, patterns. It infers meaning from these visual cues. And if the cues are carefully crafted, the inference will be wrong. In a manor house in Buckinghamshire, now commandeered by the War Office, intelligence officers spread reconnaissance photographs across a wide oak table. These are German photographs, captured or acquired through neutral channels, showing how the Luftwaffe sees Britain from above. The officers study them with the intensity of art critics examining a painting, learning to see as their enemy sees. They note that at high altitude, a tank appears as a dark rectangular shape with a distinctive shadow pattern. An aircraft on an airfield shows as a cruciform silhouette, wings extending from fuselage. A truck convoy creates a line of regular shapes on a road. All of these visual signatures, they realize, can be replicated. Not with functioning machines that would require impossible resources, but with materials humble and abundant. Wood, canvas, paint, wire, straw. The detritus of agricultural Britain transformed into the illusion of military might. The directive goes out in February 1940. Establish a new unit dedicated to visual deception. It will be called, with characteristic British understatement, the Camouflage Development and Training Center, though its mission is not camouflage in the traditional sense, but its opposite, spectacular visibility designed to mislead. The unit will report to Colonel Turner, an engineer with an artist's eye and a gambler's nerve. Turner understands that the project's success depends on German psychology as much as British craftsmanship. The Germans must be fed information that confirms their existing assumptions. They expect Britain to defend its southeast coast, the region closest to occupied France, the obvious landing sites for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned invasion. Therefore, that is precisely where the Phantom Army will appear. By March, the first dummy tanks are ready for deployment. They are remarkably simple constructions, timber frames covered with painted canvas, mounted on wheeled platforms that allow them to be moved by two men. From ground level up close, they are obviously fake, almost comical in their crudeness. The canvas sags. The paint is uneven, the proportions are slightly wrong. But from 15,000 feet, photographed through the limitations of 1940s optics, they are indistinguishable from the real thing. The shadows are correct. The dimensions match German intelligence files on British armor. The camouflage patterns replicate those used by actual British tank units. Each dummy costs approximately 15 pounds to construct, less than 1,000th the cost of a real tank. And each one, if the deception works, will absorb German attention and resources far exceeding its modest price. The dummy tanks are deployed in fields across Kent and Sussex in carefully choreographed arrangements that simulate realistic military dispositions. They are positioned near genuine military installations to add credibility. Real soldiers are photographed moving near them. Genuine supply trucks visit the sites on regular schedules. Wireless traffic is generated from the locations, brief encrypted messages that German signals intelligence will intercept and log as evidence of active military units. Every detail is considered. Even the tracks in the mud are created using specialized rollers that replicate the tread patterns of real armor. The illusion must be complete, because the Germans will be looking for inconsistencies, for proof that what they see is false. The burden of proof, however, rests with the skeptic. As long as everything appears normal, human nature tends toward acceptance rather than doubt. The Germans photographed the dummy installations throughout the spring of 1940. Reconnaissance flights increase in frequency as the invasion planning intensifies. In Berlin and Paris, intelligence analysts compile reports documenting British defensive preparations. They note the concentration of armor in the southeast. They estimate battalion strengths based on the counted vehicles. They identify what appear to be new tank parks, airfields, artillery positions. All of this information feeds into the German operational planning for Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe will need to neutralize these forces before the Wehrmacht can land. Target lists are prepared. Bomb tonnage calculations are made. Flight paths are plotted. Hundreds of hours of German military planning are now predicated on the existence of an army that does not exist. But the British are not content with static displays. They understand that a convincing deception must evolve, must show signs of life and activity. So the dummy tanks are moved periodically, repositioned to suggest tactical repositioning. New installations appear overnight, photographed by German reconnaissance the next morning, confirming enemy fears of British reinforcement. Some dummy installations are deliberately allowed to fall into disrepair, while new ones are constructed elsewhere, simulating the natural cycle of military deployment. The British are creating not just false images, but false narratives, a story of British military activity that the Germans can track and analyze, never realizing it is fiction. The psychological warfare extends beyond visual deception. British intelligence begins feeding false information through double agents, captured German spies who have been turned and are now working for the British. These agents report back to their German handlers about troop movements they have supposedly observed, information that corroborates what German aerial reconnaissance is photographing. The web of deception has multiple strands, each reinforcing the others, creating a consensus reality that exists only in German intelligence files and in the minds of Wehrmacht planners. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the operation, understanding that the Germans will not trust a single source, but will trust multiple independent sources that tell the same story. So the British provide those multiple sources, all controlled, all telling the same careful lie. Summer arrives, and with it, the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launches its campaign to achieve air superiority over southern England, the necessary precursor to invasion. And now the deception operation moves into its active phase. German bombers tasked with destroying British military capacity begin striking the targets identified by intelligence. They bomb the dummy tank parks in Kent. They crater the fields in Essex, where plywood aircraft sit in neat rows. They drop thousands of pounds of high explosives on installations that dissolve into splinters and canvas scraps, offering no resistance, creating no secondary explosions, producing no casualties. The bombs fall on empty fields, on timber and paint, on the work of carpenters and stage designers. Each bombing run is recorded by the Luftwaffe as a success. Each target destroyed is crossed off the list. And the British, monitoring German radio traffic and aerial activity, realize with growing amazement that the deception is working beyond their most optimistic projections. The cost to Germany is staggering. A single bombing raid requires fuel, aircraft maintenance, pilot fatigue, bomb expenditure, operational planning, and risk. Every raid carries the possibility of losing aircraft and trained crew to British air defenses. When these resources are expended against fake targets, they represent pure waste, effort that accomplishes nothing. German historians would later calculate that during the summer and autumn of 1940, the Luftwaffe dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs on British deception installations. Bombs that could have been used against actual military targets, against factories, against ports. The Phantom Army is absorbing punishment intended for the real British forces, serving as a massive decoy that draws enemy fire away from genuine strategic assets. But what the British could not have fully anticipated was the psychological dimension of their success. The German bomber crews returning from these raids report successful target destruction. They have no reason to think otherwise. They saw the bombs fall, saw the explosions, saw the targets disappear in smoke and flame. The pilots and bombardiers are told they are winning, systematically dismantling British defensive capabilities. This false success creates a dangerous overconfidence in German planning. The Luftwaffe command believes it is achieving air superiority more quickly than is actually the case. They believe British armor and aircraft numbers are declining. They believe the pathway to invasion is being cleared. And this belief leads to strategic decisions based on faulty premises, decisions to shift bombing priorities, to reallocate resources, to proceed with invasion planning when the actual military situation does not justify that confidence. The British, meanwhile, are learning lessons that will serve them throughout the war. They are learning that modern warfare is as much about information and perception as about physical combat. They are learning that a small investment in deception can yield strategic dividends far exceeding the investment. Most importantly, they are learning that their enemy, despite its fearsome reputation, despite its technological sophistication, despite its recent string of victories, is vulnerable to creative thinking. The Germans have built their war machine on principles of industrial efficiency and methodical planning. These are tremendous strengths, but they also create predictability. And predictability creates vulnerability. The British, operating from weakness, are forced to be unpredictable. They cannot match German strength directly, so they attack German assumptions. They cannot outproduce German industry, so they make German production targets irrelevant by ensuring that production is directed against false targets. Autumn 1940. A German intelligence officer sits in a requisitioned French chateau reviewing reconnaissance photographs under lamplight. The photographs show the results of recent Luftwaffe raids, destroyed British military installations reduced to rubble. He makes notes in his report. Enemy armor concentrations in Kent sector successfully neutralized, estimated 60% destruction of identified tank formations. He does not know that what he is looking at is the shattered remains of canvas and wood. He does not know that the armor formations never existed. He has been trained to interpret photographic evidence, to identify military equipment, to assess damage. And the evidence before him appears conclusive. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the deception. The Germans are not stupid, nor are they negligent. They are competent, careful analysts working with the best information available to them. But the information itself has been poisoned at its source. They are building their understanding of reality on foundations of carefully constructed lies. The symbolic object in this vast deception is not a weapon or a machine, but wood itself, humble British timber, the same material used for centuries to build homes and ships and furniture, now repurposed as an instrument of war. Wood has no martial glamour. It cannot stop a bullet or destroy a tank. But in the hands of creative strategists, wood becomes more powerful than steel because it represents the power of imagination over material force. Each wooden tank is a small act of defiance, a declaration that cleverness can defeat strength, that perception can be weaponized as effectively as explosives. The Germans have mastered the physical aspects of warfare, the tanks, aircraft, artillery, tactics. They have not mastered the cognitive dimension, the realm of belief and assumption. And it is in this cognitive realm that the British are waging their most effective campaign. By winter, Operation Sea Lion is indefinitely postponed. The Luftwaffe has failed to achieve air superiority. British defenses remain formidable. The invasion will not happen. Historians debate the many factors that contributed to this outcome: the courage of RAF pilots, the effectiveness of radar, the resilience of British industrial production, strategic errors by Göring and Hitler. But among these factors, rarely emphasized, is the contribution of the Phantom Army. How many German bombs fell on fake targets instead of real ones? How many German pilots risked their lives attacking plywood? How many hours of German planning were wasted preparing to counter forces that did not exist? The accounting is impossible to complete with precision, but the cumulative effect is undeniable. Britain's program of visual deception bought time, preserved resources, and confused enemy planning at a critical moment when any advantage, however unconventional, was desperately needed. The lessons learned in 1940 will be applied on an even grander scale in 1944. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan supporting the D-Day invasion, will create an entire Phantom Army group in southeast England under the fictional command of General Patton. This force, composed of inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, dummy landing craft, and elaborate radio deception, will convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion will strike the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Germans will hold back critical armored divisions for weeks after D-Day, waiting for the real invasion that will never come. And the tools used in Fortitude, the techniques, the principles, the understanding of how perception shapes military reality, all trace their lineage back to those first crude wooden tanks deployed in Kent fields in the winter of 1940. But in those early days, none of this future success is certain. The men building the dummy equipment work in cold workshops with aching hands, often questioning whether their effort matters. The intelligence officers planning the deception operations second-guess their own assumptions, wondering if they are wasting resources on elaborate fantasies while real defenses languish. The pilots who fly the reconnaissance missions to photograph the decoy sites and verify that they appear convincing from altitude risk their lives for what seems like theater. Everyone involved understands they are attempting something unprecedented, something that could easily fail, that could be exposed at any moment by a captured document or a German spy who manages to inspect a dummy installation up close. The entire enterprise rests on maintaining the illusion, and illusions are fragile things, especially under the harsh scrutiny of war. The German response, when years later former Luftwaffe officers learn the truth about what they bombed, is instructive. Some express admiration for British ingenuity. Others feel a sense of betrayal, as if the British violated some unstated rule of warfare by fighting with imagination rather than firepower. This reaction reveals something profound about military culture and the psychology of combat. There is an expectation, often unspoken, that war should be conducted according to certain norms, that armies fight armies, that strength is measured in quantifiable terms like tonnage and divisions, that deception is a minor tactical tool rather than a strategic weapon. The British violation of these norms, their willingness to turn deception into an industrial-scale operation, to devote significant resources to creating elaborate fictions, to gamble national survival on theatrical techniques, represents a kind of innovation that makes traditional military thinking uncomfortable. It suggests that the whole framework of military power, with its emphasis on measurable quantities and direct force, may be less decisive than assumed. It suggests that wars might be won or lost in the realm of perception and belief before a shot is fired. This cognitive dimension of warfare becomes increasingly important as the war progresses and technology advances. Radar, radio intercept, photo intelligence, signals analysis, all of these create new channels through which information flows, and therefore new opportunities for deception. The side that masters deception gains the ability to manipulate enemy decision-making at every level. They can make the enemy see threats that do not exist, overlook threats that do exist, waste resources, miscalculate timing, position forces incorrectly. In the great chess game of military strategy, deception allows you to control what pieces your opponent believes are on the board. And if you can control your opponent's perception of reality, you can defeat them before the battle even begins, or avoid battles entirely by making the opponent hesitate, delay, or strike the wrong targets. The wooden tanks that the Germans mocked, that seemed to Luftwaffe pilots like obvious targets, like easy victories to chalk up in combat reports, turn out to be the most cost-effective weapons Britain deployed in 1940. A wooden tank that draws a bombing raid has accomplished more than most real tanks could achieve. It has wasted enemy resources without risk to British personnel. It has contributed to enemy overconfidence and strategic miscalculation. It has tied up German reconnaissance and intelligence analysis in tracking a phantom threat. And it has done all of this for the cost of lumber and canvas, materials so mundane they seem absurd as instruments of grand strategy. Yet history is full of such absurdities, of small things that cast long shadows, of humble materials that become decisive through human ingenuity. There is something deeply British about this whole enterprise, something that reflects national character in ways both inspiring and instructive. The British in 1940 are facing existential threat. They have been expelled from the continent. Their army lost much of its equipment at Dunkirk. They stand alone against a victorious enemy. In this desperate circumstance, they might have despaired. Instead, they built an army of ghosts. They turned their theaters and film studios into factories of illusion. They took their carpenters and artists and asked them to wage war with hammers and paintbrushes. This response reflects a particular kind of creativity born from constraint, the ability to look at limited resources and see not limitation, but possibility. To transform weakness into strategy, to fight not with what you wish you had, but with what you actually possess, ingeniously applied. The story of Britain's deception operations also reveals the power of institutional creativity. The British military in 1940 was hardly a bastion of radical thinking. It was a traditional institution with conservative instincts, still recovering from the trauma of World War I, still debating whether tanks and aircraft had truly made cavalry obsolete. Yet this same institution proved capable of embracing ideas that seemed on their face almost ridiculous. Wooden tanks, fake airfields, elaborate theatrical productions staged for the benefit of enemy reconnaissance. The willingness to try such unconventional approaches, to give them resources and official sanction, to risk credibility on schemes that might fail spectacularly. This institutional flexibility may be Britain's most important asset in 1940, more valuable even than the physical courage of RAF pilots or the engineering ingenuity that will develop radar. Organizations that cannot adapt, that cannot embrace unconventional thinking when circumstances demand it, cannot survive in environments as unforgiving as total war. December 1940. The winter sun sets early over the coast of England. In fields across the southeast, dummy tanks sit in silent rows, their canvas sides flapping in the cold wind. Some are torn from German strafing runs. Others are waterlogged from autumn rains, their paint peeling, their timber frames beginning to rot. They look, in the fading light, like what they are: cheap fakes, obvious frauds that no one could possibly mistake for real military equipment. But in Berlin and Paris, in German intelligence archives, these decaying wooden structures are recorded as destroyed British armor, as confirmed kills, as evidence of Luftwaffe effectiveness. The gap between reality and recorded reality has never been wider. And in that gap, in that space between what is true and what is believed to be true, Britain has found room to survive. The men who built these deceptions will not receive medals or public recognition, not during the war. Their work is classified, too valuable to reveal, too useful to compromise with publicity. They will return to their civilian occupations when the war ends, carrying classified secrets, unable to tell even their families exactly what they did during those desperate years. The carpenters will build homes instead of fake tanks. The stage designers will return to theaters. The artists will paint on canvas that is not stretched over timber frames pretending to be armored vehicles. And for decades, their contribution will remain obscure, a footnote in histories focused on more dramatic battles and more visible heroes. But their work altered the course of the war as surely as any military victory, as surely as radar or code-breaking or industrial production. The Germans, for their part, will eventually learn what they bombed in 1940. Captured documents after the war, post-war intelligence reviews, the opening of archives. Gradually, the truth emerges. The reaction is mixed. Some German officers express professional appreciation for the British deception skills. Others feel humiliated, angry at having been fooled so completely. A few refuse to believe it, insisting that the post-war British accounts must themselves be exaggerated, that surely not all those targets were fake, that their bombs must have accomplished something. This resistance to accepting the truth is itself revealing. We construct our understanding of our own experiences through narrative, and when those narratives are revealed as false, the psychological disruption can be profound. The Luftwaffe pilots who believed they were systematically destroying British military capacity were, in their own minds, winning the war. To learn that this victory was illusion, that their courage and skill and sacrifice were directed against targets deliberately designed to waste their efforts. This knowledge challenges the entire meaning they had assigned to their experiences. But there is a larger truth embedded in this story, a truth about the nature of power and conflict in the modern world. For centuries, military power was primarily about physical capacity, numbers of soldiers, quality of weapons, industrial production, geographic position. These factors remain important, but the 20th century introduces a new dimension, the information space. Wars are increasingly fought not just on physical battlefields, but in the realm of perception, belief, and knowledge. Whoever controls information, who can gather it, analyze it, protect it, and manipulate it, gains advantages that can rival or exceed traditional military strength. Britain's deception operations represent an early recognition of this shift. The British understood, perhaps before anyone else fully grasped it, that in modern warfare you could weaponize belief itself. You could create false realities that your enemy would accept and act upon. You could make them defeat themselves by feeding them lies disguised as intelligence. This insight has implications far beyond World War II. In every subsequent conflict, deception and information warfare play increasingly central roles. The Cold War becomes as much about perception and intelligence as about nuclear arsenals. Modern conflicts involve cyber warfare, propaganda, disinformation campaigns, battles fought in cognitive space. The wooden tanks of 1940 are the ancestors of these modern techniques, the first industrial-scale application of perception management as strategic weapon. They represent a recognition that in warfare, as in much of human experience, reality is less important than believed reality. What your enemy thinks is true will determine their actions more than what is actually true. If you can control their beliefs, you can control their behavior. There is also something poignant about the image of those wooden tanks sitting in English fields, waiting to be bombed. They are sacrifices of a sort, not living soldiers, but representatives nonetheless, standing in place of real equipment and real people, absorbing punishment meant for others. Each bomb that falls on a dummy installation is a bomb that does not fall on a genuine target, does not kill actual soldiers, does not destroy real equipment. In this sense, the wooden tanks serve a protective function, like decoys used by animals to distract predators. They are part of an elaborate survival strategy evolved under pressure, an adaptation to an environment where direct confrontation means certain defeat. Britain in 1940 cannot match German military power directly, so it evolves an alternative approach, one based on misdirection rather than force. And this alternative proves remarkably effective, suggesting that in conflict, as in biology, there are multiple pathways to survival, and the strong do not always prevail over the clever. The story also raises questions about the ethics of military deception. Is it fair to make an enemy waste resources attacking false targets? The question seems almost absurd in the context of total war, where entire cities are being bombed and millions are dying. Yet it touches on something real about human expectations of conflict. There is a sense, perhaps naive but persistent, that fighting should involve confronting genuine threats, that courage and sacrifice should be directed toward real objectives. When those objectives turn out to be fabrications, there is a sense of betrayal, of having been made foolish. The Germans who bombed wooden tanks were brave men risking their lives. The fact that their bravery was misdirected, turned against phantoms, does not diminish their courage, but does render it tragically meaningless. And there is something unsettling about this, about the ability of deception to empty heroic action of meaning, to turn sacrifice into farce. Yet from the British perspective, the moral calculation is straightforward. They are fighting for survival against an enemy committed to their subjugation or destruction. In such circumstances, any stratagem that avoids shedding blood while degrading enemy capability is not just permissible, but praiseworthy. The wooden tanks kill no one. They simply mislead. And in misleading, they save lives, British lives primarily, but also German lives, since every German pilot who bombs a fake target and returns safely is a pilot who did not die in combat that day. Deception, in this light, becomes a more humane form of warfare, one that achieves strategic objectives through cleverness rather than killing. This is probably an overly optimistic interpretation. War remains war, brutal and deadly. But it is worth noting that the deception operations of 1940 represent a form of resistance that minimizes rather than maximizes violence, that seeks to win through making the enemy impotent rather than destroying them. As the war continues beyond 1940, the sophistication of British deception only increases. Entire organizations are established to coordinate deception operations across theaters. The London Controlling Section coordinates strategic deception policy. A Force in the Middle East creates phantom armies that tie down Axis forces. American planners learn from British experience and develop their own deception capabilities. By 1944, Operation Fortitude employs thousands of personnel and creates deception operations of staggering complexity. Not just dummy equipment, but false radio traffic, double agents, controlled leaks, fabricated documents, all orchestrated to create in German minds an entirely fictitious reality of Allied invasion planning. And it works. The Germans keep divisions in the Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that will never come, because the Phantom Army created in 1940 has grown into an entire Phantom Army group whose supposed existence shapes German strategic deployment. The seeds planted in those winter fields in Kent grow into a forest of illusions that help shape the outcome of the war. But it all begins with wood and canvas, with carpenters and stage designers working in cold workshops, with a gamble that perception could be weaponized, that the enemy's eyes could be turned against them. It begins with the humble recognition that Britain cannot outproduce or outfight Germany in conventional terms, and must therefore fight unconventionally. It begins with creativity born from desperation, with the willingness to try something unprecedented because the alternatives are worse. And it succeeds because the Germans, despite their formidable capabilities, make the mistake of underestimating British imagination. They expect Britain to fight according to established patterns, to behave predictably. When Britain instead fights with theater and illusion, the Germans lack the conceptual framework to recognize what is happening. They see what they expect to see, what their training has taught them to identify. They do not see what is actually there, stage props dressed up as an army. In the end, The wooden tanks of 1940 matter not because they destroyed German forces, they destroyed nothing, but because they preserved British forces by deflecting German attention and firepower. They matter because they demonstrated that industrial-age warfare could be fought with theatrical techniques, that perception was a domain of combat as important as land, sea, or air. They matter because they proved that a nation fighting for survival could find resources even in imagination, could turn artists and carpenters into warriors whose weapons were creativity and carefully crafted lies. They matter because they showed that strength is not always measured in tons of steel or numbers of divisions, that sometimes the most powerful force on a battlefield is a belief, true or false, that shapes how the enemy thinks and acts. And perhaps they matter most because they represent a truth about human conflict that transcends any particular war. That we are creatures who live in stories as much as in physical reality, and whoever controls the story has power over those who believe it. The British told the Germans a story about British military preparations in the southeast, a story communicated through photographs and intelligence reports and agent messages. The Germans believed that story because it confirmed their expectations, because it appeared to be supported by multiple independent sources, because it seemed reasonable, and because they believed the story, they acted on it, directing their forces against fictional threats, wasting resources, making strategic errors. The story, though false, had real effects. The dummy tanks, though wood and canvas, had weight in history. They changed what happened next, diverted the path of events, saved lives, and bought time during Britain's most desperate hour. When the last wooden tank finally collapses into rotted lumber, when the canvas finally dissolves, when the paint fades and the timber returns to earth, nothing physical will remain of these peculiar weapons. But their legacy persists in every modern military's understanding that information is a domain of warfare, that perception is tactical terrain to be fought over, that believing something is true can make it operationally true even when it is factually false. The Germans never took those wooden tanks seriously enough, never imagined that Britain would invest significant effort in such apparent foolishness. This failure of imagination cost them dearly. And the lesson endures. Underestimate human creativity at your peril, particularly the creativity of those fighting for survival. The desperate and the clever are dangerous opponents because they fight in ways that strength alone cannot counter. They fight in the spaces between what is and what is believed to be, in the gap between reality and perception. And in those spaces, wooden tanks can win wars.